An insurgent's decapitated head splattered blue blood across Princess Zephyr's tear-streaked face as the human soldier ended her would-be assassin. Zephyr, the rebellious daughter of the Talarian emperor, had never imagined owing her life to a lowly human, yet here she was, helplessly cowering under a desk until this man intervened. She looked up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes and whispered, "You saved me." But the gruff soldier simply cut her off. "Thank me later, princess. Let's move." Just moments earlier, Walter Brown had been video chatting with his young son back on Earth, the boy excitedly showing off their adorable new German Shepherd puppy named Maverick. The 35-year-old former Navy SEAL now worked as head of security for a top-secret joint human-Talarian research facility on the distant planet Zeta Reticuli b. It was a boring job, until today. Alarms suddenly blared, interrupting the call. The facility was under attack by Talarian insurgents, fanatical rebels intent on destroying the fragile human-Talarian alliance. Brown quickly told his son he'd be home soon, then grabbed his pulse rifle and sprinted towards the sounds of explosions and weapons fire. Rounding a corner, he saw a squad of insurgents ruthlessly gunning down fleeing researchers. These monsters were slaughtering innocent people, and they were heading straight for the lab holding mankind's most critical secret project. Using the skills that made him a legendary SEAL, Brown efficiently dropped the attackers with precise headshots. He couldn't let these rebel scum capture their research. If humanity's classified work here fell into insurgent hands, it could spell doom for the Talarians and an interstellar war for Earth. Brown radioed the facility AI to lock down the most sensitive areas. Just then, Princess Zephyr's cry for help caught his attention from a nearby room. He decapitated the insurgent standing over her with a single shot. The spoiled alien princess might be a pain in the ass, but she was a critical diplomatic asset. He had to get her to safety. The future of the human-Talarian alliance depended on it. He grabbed Zephyr's hand and yanked her to her feet. "We need to get you off-world now." Brown started battling their way towards the hangar bay housing his personal ship. More insurgents flooded the corridors. The human grimly realized this was no ordinary rebel attack. It was a surgical strike to abduct the princess. If these fanatics captured Zephyr, they could force the Emperor to make devastating concessions, or even push the two species to war. Brown was just one man against an army. But the veteran soldier would rather die than fail his duty. He had to get the princess to safety, and he'd fight through the hordes of hell itself to do it. Humanity's future hung in the balance. Their frantic escape continued as Brown and Zephyr burst into the hangar bay, only to find the human's ship engulfed in flames, a smoldering wreck destroyed by insurgent forces. "Fuck!" Brown smashed his fist against a bulkhead, mind racing. His eyes darted around the hangar, searching for any means of escape. He spotted a Talarian transport vessel in the far corner. "There! We'll take that ship!" They sprinted across the hangar, pulse blasts from pursuing rebels sizzling past them. Brown leapt into the cockpit, hands hovering over the alien controls. "Shit, I don't know how to fly this thing." Zephyr shoved him aside, fingers flying across the console. "Move, human!" The ship roared to life, engines flaring. Brown strapped in, eyebrows raised as Zephyr deftly maneuvered the ship out of the hangar, plasma fire from insurgent weapons peppering their shields. "What? You think I can't fly?" the princess challenged, seeing his surprised expression. A wry smile tugged at Brown's lips. "I think you're full of surprises, but right now I need to know why these insurgents are after you." Zephyr's hands tightened on the controls, eyes flashing with anger. "My father is a tyrant. These insurgents are freedom fighters trying to overthrow his brutal rule. I was sympathetic to their cause, but now—" She shook her head. "I realized, too late, they're just as ruthless as him. They think if they capture me, they can force my father to abdicate the throne." A sudden explosion rocked the ship, alarms blaring. A rebel fighter screamed into view behind them, weapons blazing. "I'll handle this." Brown leapt into the gunner's seat, swiveling the rear cannon around. The fighter filled his targeting reticle. He squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of superheated plasma towards their pursuer. The rebel ship juked and jinked, trying to evade Brown's fire. It was a lethal game of chicken in the upper atmosphere, each pilot pushing their skills to the limit. Sweat beaded on Brown's forehead as he poured shot after shot at the insurgent. Finally, one of his blasts found its mark, grazing the enemy's propulsion systems. The fighter spiraled away, belching smoke and fire. In the pilot's seat, Zephyr frantically typed in hyperspace coordinates. With a bone-jarring jolt, the ship leapt to faster-than-light speeds, the rebel fighter disappearing behind them. They both sat back, adrenaline slowly fading. Zephyr turned to Brown, eyes haunted. "What now? You heard what I said. I can't go back home." Brown chewed his lip for a moment, considering. Then he nodded, decision made. "We're going to Earth. I've got an idea." Brown guided their stolen Talarian transport vessel down through Earth's atmosphere, the ship's autopilot handling the intricacies of re-entry. As the craft settled onto the grass in front of a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, Zephyr glanced out the viewport apprehensively. "What is this place?" she asked. "Somewhere safe, for now," Brown replied gruffly as he powered down the ship's systems. He lowered the boarding ramp and strode out into the sunlight, Zephyr trailing behind him hesitantly. Suddenly, a loud barking shattered the forest's tranquility. Zephyr startled, hand instinctively reaching for a non-existent weapon, but it was no threat that came bounding across the grass towards them. It was the wriggling, furry form of a German shepherd puppy. "Maverick!" a young voice cried out joyfully. Brown's son came racing out of the cabin, arms outstretched. The soldier dropped to one knee, catching the boy in a tight embrace as Maverick yipped and circled them excitedly. Over the next several days, as Brown worked tirelessly to secure long-term protection and asylum for the princess, an unlikely bond began to form between the alien royal and the young human boy. United by their shared experiences with overbearing dictatorial fathers, they found solace in each other's company. Zephyr was endlessly fascinated by Maverick, never having encountered a creature quite like an Earth canine before. The boy took great delight in teaching her how to play fetch, tossing a ball for the eager German shepherd to chase down and return. He even showed her how to give basic commands. One warm afternoon, as Zephyr and the boy romped in the yard with an energetic Maverick, Brown headed into the nearby town for supplies, promising to return shortly. No sooner had his truck disappeared down the dirt road than the very air around the property began to shimmer and warp. A dozen black-clad figures materialized out of thin air, the grass wilting beneath their boots. Talarian special forces, their sleek armor adorned with the Emperor's sigil. They had tracked Zephyr's biosignature across the vastness of space to this remote corner of an alien world, and now they closed in on their target with ruthless efficiency. Maverick's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he caught the scent of the intruders. Placing himself between the soldiers and the princess, he began to bark furiously, hackles raised in warning. As the soldiers advanced, Maverick bared his teeth and lunged, latching onto the forearm of the nearest Talarian with a snarl. The trooper cried out in pain, his weapon clattering to the ground. The distraction bought Zephyr a precious few seconds. "Run!" she shouted, seizing the boy's hand. They sprinted for the cabin as plasma bolts sizzled through the air around them, Maverick harrying the soldiers and disrupting their aim. Zephyr burst through the front door, slamming and locking it behind them. Outside she heard a pained yelp, then silence. Maverick. Fighting back tears, she shoved the boy behind her, shielding him with her body as the soldiers stacked up against the door, preparing to breach. This was it, then. The end. She squeezed her eyes shut. And a hail of gunfire erupted from the rear of the property, followed by strangled screams and the sizzle of burning flesh. The cabin door crashed open. Zephyr's eyes flew wide, but it was no Talarian death squad that confronted her. It was Brown, an assault rifle clutched in his hands, the barrel smoking. His face was a mask of cold fury. Brown kicked Talarian corpses off the cabin's porch, pulse rifle still clutched tight. Zephyr emerged cautiously from inside, the boy peeking out behind her. "Give me a minute." Brown pulled out his comms unit. As Zephyr helped the boy gather essentials, Brown crouched beside Maverick's still form. The dog whimpered softly as Brown examined the plasma wound. "Easy, boy," Brown murmured. "You did good." The German shepherd's thick coat had absorbed the worst of the shot. It was an ugly burn, but treatable. Brown smeared healing salve over the wound and wrapped it securely. "He gonna be okay?" the boy asked, hovering anxiously nearby. Brown stood. "He'll be fine, Slugger. Maverick's a tough pup." He clapped his hands. "All right, everyone in the SUV. Time to roll out." They piled into the armored vehicle waiting in the garage. Brown gunned the engine, and they sped off down winding back roads, putting distance between them and the compromised safe house. Brown drove evasively, checking the rear camera often. After several tense hours, a secluded military compound came into view. Razor wire adorned the electrified perimeter fence. Brown flashed his ID at the gate, and it slid open. "Where are we?" Zephyr asked as they parked. "Black site. We'll be safe here for now. Called in a favor with my old commander." A medical team met them, transferring a woozy Maverick onto a gurney. The boy made to follow, but Brown stopped him. "Let the docs work, kiddo. He's in good hands." Suddenly, klaxons blared. Soldiers scrambled. A comms officer's panicked voice crackled over the intercom. "Talarian warships have just dropped out of hyperspace. They're entering Earth orbit." Brown and his commander rushed over to a wall screen. The Emperor's sneering visage filled the display. "People of Earth," he drawled, "you have unlawfully detained a citizen of the Talarian Imperium. Return Princess Zephyr to us immediately or suffer the consequences. You have 1 hour to comply." The transmission ended. The commander turned to Brown, expression grave. "You have to give her back, Walt. We can't risk interstellar war over this." Brown shook his head vehemently. "If we cave now, the Talarians will walk all over us in future negotiations. We can't show weakness." The two men stared each other down, neither budging. Zephyr stepped forward, voice ringing with conviction. "Commander, I appreciate your desire to protect your people, but I must speak to my father. Let me talk to him." The commander hesitated, then nodded. "Very well." In the Black Site's comms hub, Zephyr faced the camera, spine straight as steel. She took a deep breath, then began. "Father, call off your dogs. I am safe and well, but I will not be returning to Talaria Prime. Not until you've ended your tyrannical rule and agreed to transition our government to a true democracy." Her eyes blazed with righteous anger. "If you thought you could bully the humans into returning me, think again. The people of Earth are not so easily cowed, and neither am I. Your reign of terror is over, Father. I'll see to it myself if I have to." She jabbed the button, ending the transmission abruptly. The Talarian fleet loomed in the blackness above Earth, a row of gleaming warships bristling with weapons. On the bridge of the flagship, the Talarian commander stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a triumphant sneer twisting his features as he stared at the blue-green world slowly spinning below. "Charge all plasma cannons," he ordered, his voice cold. "Let's show these primitives the price of defiance." In the bowels of the military black site, klaxons blared and red emergency lights flashed. Soldiers and scientists alike sprinted through the corridors, the thud of boots against metal grating nearly drowned out by the urgent shouts and barked commands. Brown gripped Zephyr's hand tightly, his other arm wrapped around his son's shoulders as he guided them through the chaos. Maverick limped along at his side, ears flat against his skull. The soldier's jaw was set, eyes hard as flint. He had a plan, a desperate one, but their only shot. He led them into a cavernous hangar bay, where a trio of sleek, angular fighters waited, their matte black hulls seeming to drink in the light. Zephyr's eyes widened as she realized what they were. Experimental craft, reverse-engineered from captured Talarian ships, packed with the best tech Earth had to offer. Brown turned to face the princess, his expression grim. "Zephyr, I need you to take my son and get out of here. Take one of the fighters and go." Zephyr shook her head vehemently, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I won't leave you behind." "Oh, you have to," Brown said firmly, his calloused hands gripping her shoulders. "You're the future of your people, Princess. If we're going to have any chance at peace, you need to survive." A single tear slid down Zephyr's cheek as the weight of his words sank in. She knew he was right. Drawing in a shaky breath, she nodded. Brown knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce hug. "I love you, kiddo. Be brave for me, okay? Take care of Zephyr." With a final squeeze, Brown released him and stood. He helped Zephyr and the boy climb into the cockpit of the nearest fighter, hastily showing the princess the basic controls. "The ship's AI will handle most of the flying," he assured her. "Just keep her steady and let the autopilot do its job once you're clear of the hangar." Brown said nothing. He couldn't make that promise. Stepping back, he watched as the canopy lowered and sealed with a hiss. The fighter's engines flared to life, maneuvering thrusters flaring as it lifted off the deck. With a roar that shook the entire hangar, the craft shot forward, rapidly shrinking to a pinprick of light in the sky as it streaked away. Maverick limped up beside Brown, letting out a soft whine. The soldier glanced down at his faithful companion, lips quirking in a grim smile. He knelt and scratched the dog behind the ears. Minutes later, Brown's fighter exploded out of the hangar, Maverick safely harnessed into the co-pilot seat. The soldier's hands danced over the unfamiliar controls, quickly adapting to the alien interface. Jaw clenched with determination, he angled the ship towards the waiting Talarian fleet and hit the comm. "This is Walter Brown of Earth," he declared, his voice hard as granite. "I'm only going to say this once. Stand down or face the consequences." Derisive laughter crackled over the channel. "You are just one ship, human," the Talarian commander sneered. "What do you think you can do against the might of the Talarian Empire?" Brown's eyes narrowed, a predatory smile touching his lips. "You'd be surprised." With a flick of a switch, the fighter shimmered and vanished as the cloaking device engaged. Zephyr watched from afar, hands white-knuckled on the controls of her own ship, as Brown's craft disappeared from her sensors. For a moment all was still. The Talarian ships hung silent and menacing against the stars, weapons primed but not firing, as if unsure where to aim. A volley of searing quantum torpedoes appeared out of nowhere, slamming into the flagship's aft section in a blinding flash of light. The massive ship lurched, explosions blossoming along its hull as the projectiles ripped through armor and tore into vital systems. The rest of the Talarian fleet began to frantically pivot and fire in all directions, disruptor bolts and plasma blasts crisscrossing the void. But they were firing blind, unable to lock onto the cloaked fighter that danced unseen between their ships. Zephyr watched in awe as Brown's ship winked in and out of visibility, striking with surgical precision at the Talarians' weak points, a sensor array here, an exposed weapons battery there. Each hit was carefully calculated to sow maximum chaos and confusion among the enemy ranks. One by one, the mighty Talarian warships began to falter and drift, venting atmosphere and trailing debris. The flagship listed heavily, its once proud lines marred by gaping, scorched wounds. But the Talarians were far from defeated. Rallying, the commander ordered the fleet to assume a tight defensive formation, overlapping their shields to cover blind spots and collectively charge their main cannons. With the Talarian fleet regrouping for a final assault, Zephyr gritted her teeth, fingers flying over the cockpit controls. Brown's diversionary attack had bought them precious minutes, but it wouldn't last. She had to act now, while the Talarians were still off balance. "Hold on tight," she called over her shoulder to the boy. The fighter peeled away from the Earth on a new trajectory, engines straining as Zephyr pushed the throttle to the limit. They hurtled towards the looming flagship, the angular warship growing larger by the second in the viewscreen. Proximity alerts shrilled, bathing the cockpit in crimson light. Zephyr toggled the comm, broadcasting on an open channel. "Father, this is Zephyr. I'm coming aboard to negotiate a truce. Call off your attack on Earth, and I'll surrender myself to you." For a moment, silence. Then a grudging voice crackled over the speakers, the Talarian commander. "Very well, Princess. You may dock in the main hangar, but any treachery, and we will annihilate the humans without hesitation." Zephyr guided the fighter into the flagship's cavernous hangar, setting down with a gentle thud. She popped the canopy and leapt out, the boy scrambling to keep up. A phalanx of Talarian guards awaited them, pulse rifles trained on the princess. The squad leader stepped forward, gesturing curtly with his weapon. "This way! The Emperor is expecting you!" Zephyr raised her chin, projecting more confidence than she felt. "Lead on." They marched through the bowels of the ship, booted feet ringing on metal decks. Crewmen paused to stare as they passed, some with hostility, others with open curiosity. Zephyr felt the boy's hand slip into hers, small fingers trembling. At last they emerged onto the bridge, a vast chamber dominated by a raised dais at the far end, and there, seated upon a throne of polished ebony, was Emperor Zoltar himself. Zoltar rose as they approached, his regal features marred by a mix of anger and relief. "Daughter," he intoned, "you have caused me great distress, but I am glad to see you unharmed." Zephyr stepped forward, shaking off the guard's restraining hands. She faced her father back straight, eyes blazing with defiance. "I am not here for a reunion, Father. I am here to demand that you end this attack on Earth and begin the process of transitioning Talaria to a democracy." Zoltar stared at her for a long moment. Then he threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing mockingly off the bulkheads. "You are in no position to make demands, child," he said, all trace of paternal warmth gone from his voice. "I am the Emperor, and my word is law. Guards, take her to—" Suddenly alarms blared throughout the bridge, red lights flashing. On the view screen, a sleek black fighter burst from the swirling chaos of the battle outside, Brown's ship, rocketing towards the flagship on a collision course. A heartbeat later, a brown blur shot from the ship's cockpit, racing towards the bridge on 4 furry legs, Maverick, teeth bared in a snarl. Talarian guards swiveled to face the new threat, pulse rifles whining as they powered up. But Brown was right behind his canine companion, assault rifle already spitting fire. The guards dropped like marionettes with their strings cut, skulls shattered by the human's unerring aim. Maverick bunched his haunches and leapt, sailing over the suddenly unmanned security station. He slammed into Zoltar in a tangle of fur and imperial robes, bearing the Talarian ruler to the deck. Zoltar shrieked in terror, thrashing wildly as Maverick's jaws closed around his throat, not biting down but exerting just enough pressure to hold the Emperor immobile. Brown stormed onto the bridge, rifle leveled at Zoltar's head, his eyes locked with Zephyr's for a split second, 1,000 unspoken words flashing between them. Then his gaze hardened as it shifted to the Emperor. "Call off the attack, now!" Brown's voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man who had seen too much death and was prepared to deal out more. Zoltar stared cross-eyed down the rifle's barrel, then flicked a panicked glance at the fangs pressing against his jugular. He swallowed convulsively. "All ships," he stammered, Adam's apple bobbing. "Stand down, ceasefire, ceasefire." As if a spell had been broken, the Talarian crew unfroze. The tactical officer barked orders into the fleet comm, while the helm worked frantically to disengage the flagship from combat maneuvering. On the view screen, the Talarian warships peeled away from Earth, maneuvering to a safe distance. The bridge was suddenly silent save for the electronic beeping of the instruments and Zoltar's ragged breathing. Zephyr stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on Maverick's flank. The dog unclenched his jaws from the Emperor's throat and backed off, still growling low in his chest. Zoltar scrabbled away from the princess and her terrifying protector, crab-walking backwards, until he fetched up against the base of his throne. His eyes darted from his daughter to Brown to the soldiers and crew still loyal to him. But as his gaze swept the bridge, he saw only resignation, fear, and worst of all pity reflected back at him. He knew in that moment that his reign was over. He slumped, all the fight going out of him like air from a punctured balloon. Zephyr loomed over her father, face a mask of determination. "It's over, Father. You will abdicate the throne, and we will begin the process of creating a new government, one that serves the people, not the other way around." Zoltar looked up at her, seeing not the timid child he had cowed for so long. but a strong young woman forged in the crucible of hardship and tempered by the strength of her convictions. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. "I will do as you say, daughter. Talaria will change. I see now that I have been wrong. I only hope that you will guide our people more wisely than I." Zephyr said nothing. She held her father's gaze a moment longer, then turned on her heel and walked away, head high. Brown fell into step beside her, Maverick padding along at his heels. There was still much to be done. A planet to rebuild, a society to reform, and the delicate alliance with Earth to nurture. But for now, at least, the guns had fallen silent. A new day dawned for Talaria, and for the galaxy. As Zephyr and Brown marched the disgraced Emperor Zoltar through the corridors of the flagship, Maverick padded along beside them, ears pricked for any sign of trouble. The once proud Talarian ruler shuffled along, head bowed, the fight drained out of him. They were just steps away from the brig, when a plasma bolt sizzled through the air, striking Brown square in the chest. He crumpled to the deck, a smoking hole in his armor. "Walter!" Zephyr screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Crimson blood seeped between her fingers as she desperately tried to staunch the wound. Maverick whirled, hackles raised, a snarl rumbling in his throat. A dozen Talarian soldiers emerged from the shadows, pulse rifles aimed at the princess and the fallen human. At their head stood Krex, Zoltar's weaselly chief advisor, a triumphant sneer on his face. "You really thought it would be that easy, princess?" he gloated, kicking Zoltar's prone form. "Your father may be weak, but I am not. I will not let you destroy our way of life." He leveled his rifle at Zephyr's head, finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a brown blur slammed into him. Maverick, 60 pounds of furious fur and muscle. In a flash, Zephyr snatched up the fallen weapon. Blue light flared as she fired, catching Krex in the chest with a stun blast. The advisor crumpled, convulsing. She swung the rifle towards the other soldiers. "Drop your weapons now!" Faced with the princess's fury and the snarling dog, the Talarians complied, rifles clattering to the floor. Zephyr scrambled back to Brown's side, cradling his head in her lap. His face was ashen, his breath coming in short, pained gasps. "Walter, stay with me," she pleaded. "You're going to be okay." Brown coughed wetly, blood flecking his lips. "Zephyr, you need to get out of here. Take my son and take Maverick. Go back to Earth. You'll be safe there." Tears streaked Zephyr's face as she shook her head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you. We're in this together, remember?" Gritting her teeth, Zephyr heaved Brown's arm over her shoulders. Maverick whined, nudging his other side. Together they half-carried, half-dragged the wounded human through the ship, leaving a trail of blood. The flagship's medical bay was a gleaming expanse of chrome and glass. Zephyr hauled Brown onto a table, hands shaking as she activated the diagnostics. A stasis field shimmered into place around him, holding his ravaged body in suspended animation. Zephyr sagged against the table, exhaustion and fear warring in her gut. Maverick pushed his nose into her hand, whimpering softly. "He'll be all right," she whispered, as much to herself as the dog. "He has to be." Straightening, the princess turned towards the door, jaw set. She had a traitor to deal with. Krex and Zoltar knelt side by side in the flagship's brig, a flickering force field the only thing separating them from a stone-faced Zephyr. Maverick paced behind her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You will pay for what you've done," she told them, each word sharp as a knife. "But first you're going to help me save Walter's life." Krex spat on the floor. "And why would we do that, princess?" he sneered. "The human means nothing to us." Zephyr smiled coldly. "Because if he dies, so do you." As if on cue, the German shepherd lunged at the force field, snarling savagely. Zoltar blanched, shrinking back. "I'll do whatever you ask, daughter," he stammered. "Please, just keep that beast away from me." Zephyr nodded curtly. Wise choice. Zephyr's fingers danced across the flagship's command console, plotting a course back to Earth. In the brig, Krex and Zoltar sat in sullen silence, the fight drained out of them. But as the ship hurtled through hyperspace, Zephyr's thoughts turned to the advisor's parting words, other loyalists waiting to strike. She strode into the brig, Maverick padding along at her heels. The dog had refused to leave Brown's side in the medical bay, standing guard over his stasis pod with unwavering devotion. But now, sensing Zephyr's agitation, he stuck close to the princess. Zephyr came to a stop outside Krex's cell, glaring at the advisor through the shimmering force field. "I know you're hiding something, Krex. If there are any more of Zoltar's fanatics out there, I need to know. Now." Krex met her gaze, defiance etched in every line of his face. He said nothing, lips pressed into a thin line. Maverick growled, a low, menacing rumble that echoed off the brig's metal walls. Krex's eyes flicked to the German shepherd, a flicker of fear passing over his features. Zephyr crossed her arms. "Not until you tell me what I want to know." Krex hesitated, gaze darting between Zephyr and the snarling dog. Finally he relented. "There's a secret base on Talaria Prime," he ground out. "That's where Zoltar's most loyal supporters have gathered. They won't take kindly to your little coup." Zephyr's eyes narrowed. She spun on her heel, stalking back to the bridge. "Helmsman," she barked, "change course. Set coordinates for Talaria Prime." As the flagship dropped out of hyperspace above the Talarian homeworld, a swarm of unmarked fighters rose up from the planet's surface, plasma cannons blazing. The ship shuddered under the onslaught, alarms blaring. Zephyr gripped the arms of the command chair, knuckles white. "Evasive maneuvers," she ordered. "Return fire." The flagship's guns roared to life, spitting bolts of superheated plasma at the attacking fighters. But the smaller ships were agile, darting and weaving around the flagship's defenses. Zephyr's mind raced. The flagship was powerful, but it was never meant for dogfighting. They needed a new strategy. Suddenly a memory surfaced, flight lessons with her father years ago. Zoltar had been a different man then, before the weight of the crown had twisted him. He had taught her how to fly, how to outmaneuver an opponent. Zephyr's eyes snapped open. "I'm taking the helm," she declared, leaping from the command chair. The bridge crew looked at her in shock, but none dared argue. Zephyr slid into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. The flagship lurched as she wrenched it into a steep dive, plasma bolts sizzling past the viewports. In the medical bay, Maverick whined, pressing his nose against the cool metal of Brown's stasis pod. The pod's vital signs display pulsed with reassuring regularity, but the dog refused to leave his master's side. On the bridge, Zephyr gritted her teeth, putting the flagship through maneuvers that would make a fighter pilot blanch. The massive ship groaned, hull plates buckling under the strain, but slowly, surely, the tide began to turn. One by one, the Loyalist fighters winked out of existence, reduced to clouds of shrapnel by the flagship's guns. Those that survived turned tail and fled, streaking back towards the planet's surface. Zephyr sagged back in the pilot's chair, sweat beading her brow. But there was no time to rest. She had to end this once and for all. The flagship plummeted through Talaria Prime's atmosphere, hull glowing cherry red from the heat of re-entry. Zephyr guided the ship towards the coordinates Krex had provided, jaw set with determination. Zephyr was out of her seat in an instant, pulse rifle in hand. "Security teams with me," she called, leading a squad of loyal Talarian troops down the boarding ramp. They met the Loyalist forces head-on, plasma bolts crisscrossing the landing pad. Zephyr fought like a woman possessed, rifle bucking in her hands as she cut down soldier after soldier. Step by blood-soaked step, they fought their way into the base, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. At last, they reached the command center, blast doors sealing shut behind them. General Zahn stood at the room's center, a tall, gaunt figure in jet-black armor. He turned to face Zephyr, lips curling in a sneer. "Princess Zephyr," he drawled. "I wish I could say it was a pleasure." Zephyr raised her rifle, sighting down the barrel at Zahn's chest. "It's over, General. Stand down." Zahn laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Over? Oh no, my dear, it's only just begun." He gestured to a holographic display floating above a nearby console. Zephyr's eyes widened in horror. It was a doomsday device, A massive bomb, primed to detonate in the heart of the Talarian capital. With a roar of fury, Zephyr lunged at the general, rifle forgotten. They crashed to the deck, trading blows in a brutal hand-to-hand melee. Zaan was bigger, stronger, his years of combat experience giving him a deadly edge. He rained punches down on Zephyr, driving the breath from her lungs, stars exploding across her vision. The general's hands closed around her throat, squeezing with crushing force. Zephyr clawed at his fingers, lungs burning, darkness creeping in at the edges of her sight. Suddenly, a brown blur shot through the command center, slamming into Zaan with the force of a small meteor. Maverick, teeth bared in a vicious snarl, latched onto the general's arm, fangs sinking deep. Zaan howled in pain, his grip on Zephyr's throat loosening. The princess sucked in a desperate breath, spots dancing before her eyes. Seizing her chance, Zephyr swept Zaan's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the deck. She pounced, pinning the general beneath her, forearm pressed against his windpipe. The fight drained out of Zaan, his body going limp. "I yield," he rasped. Zephyr staggered to her feet, Zaan's blood dripping from her knuckles. She turned to the Doomsday device's control panel, fingers flying over the keys as she disarmed the bomb. All around her, Loyalist soldiers lowered their weapons, the fight gone out of them with their leader's defeat. Zephyr's troops moved in, securing the command center. It was over. The threat to Talaria, to Earth, had been quelled. But at what cost? Zephyr stumbled back to the flagship, Maverick limping at her side. She made her way to the medical bay, sinking into a chair beside Brown's stasis pod. The German shepherd curled up at her feet, exhausted but unwilling to leave his vigil. Zephyr placed a hand on the cool metal of the pod, fingers splaying over the vitals display. "Just hold on, Walter," she whispered, voice raw. "We're almost home." The Talarian flagship decelerated out of hyperspace, the blue-green orb of Earth looming large in the view screen. Princess Zephyr breathed a sigh of relief. They had made it. Walter Brown would get the medical care he desperately needed. But as the flagship settled into high orbit, a wall of grey shapes materialized from behind the planet's curvature, a massive Earth fleet bristling with weapons. Zephyr's breath caught in her throat. She had expected suspicion, but not outright hostility. "Incoming transmission," the calm officer announced, his voice tight. The viewscreen flickered, resolving into the stern visage of Brown's former commander. The old soldier's eyes were hard as flint. "Princess Zephyr, you are to surrender immediately. You and your ship will be taken into custody." Zephyr gaped at him, disbelief and anger warring in her chest. "What? Why? We come in peace." The commander's face twisted into a scowl. "You have kidnapped one of our own and stolen Talarian technology. We cannot trust that you come in peace." Zephyr's hands clenched into fists. From Earth's perspective, she realized her actions could easily be misconstrued, but she had no time for this. Brown's life hung in the balance. Zephyr looked to the tactical display, assessing her options. The Talarian flagship was a formidable vessel, but it was badly damaged from the battle with the Loyalists. Against the assembled might of Earth's space fleet, they wouldn't stand a chance. She was torn. Surrender and risk Brown dying before he could receive treatment. Fight and condemn her crew and the fragile peace she had worked so hard to achieve. There were no good choices. Suddenly, a small voice piped up over the comm channel. Brown's son, his words trembling but determined. "Please don't shoot. My dad is hurt and Princess Zephyr is just trying to help him." The boy's plea hung in the air. On the view screen, the commander hesitated, his resolve wavering. In that moment of indecision, a miracle occurred. A small Earthship broke formation, engines flaring as it arced towards the Talarian flagship on a collision course. Zephyr magnified the view, her eyes widening as she saw the pilot through the cockpit canopy. Somehow, impossibly, the German Shepherd had managed to start Brown's personal vessel and launch a one-dog rescue mission. Zephyr's heart swelled with a sudden, fierce love for the brave, loyal creature. The Earth fleet, thrown into disarray by the dog's charge, held its fire. Maverick's ship slid into the flagship's docking bay with barely a meter to spare, repulsors whining as the canine pilot set down. Zephyr raced through the corridors, nearly bowling over startled crewmen in her haste. She slapped the airlock controls, the hatch hissing open to reveal a panting, grinning Maverick. The princess fell to her knees, throwing her arms around the dog's shaggy neck. She buried her face in his fur, her eyes stinging with tears of relief and gratitude. The dog licked her cheek, his tail wagging fit to fly off. He seemed to be saying, "Of course I came, we're family." And with the German shepherd's arrival, a spark of hope was rekindled. Zephyr hailed the Earth commander again, Maverick at her side. She explained everything: the uprising against her father, Brown's sacrifice, the battle with the Loyalists. She bared her soul, holding nothing back. Whether it was the power of her words or the sight of the dog who had crossed the stars for his master, Zephyr didn't know. But the commander's icy demeanor finally thawed. "Very well, Princess. We'll provide medical care for Mr. Brown and open talks with your new government." Zephyr felt weak with relief. She looked down at Maverick, giving him a scratch behind the ears. "Hear that, boy? Your dad's going to be okay." As Brown was transferred to an Earth medical facility, Zephyr refused to leave his side. She sat by his bed as doctors worked to heal his wound, Maverick curled up at her feet like a furry guardian angel. She took Brown's hand, his skin pale against her own cobalt blue. Leaning close, she whispered to him, her voice thick with emotion. Days turned to weeks as Walter Brown lingered in the Earth medical facility, his body and mind slowly knitting back together. Princess Zephyr rarely left his side, her slender blue hand often intertwined with his rough, tanned one. Maverick lay curled at the foot of the bed, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm. When Brown's eyes finally fluttered open, Zephyr felt a wave of relief crash over her. She squeezed his hand, tears of joy pricking at her eyes. "Welcome back," she whispered. Brown managed a weak smile. "Couldn't leave you to handle the diplomacy alone, could I?" In the following days, as Brown regained his strength, Earth and Talaria began the delicate dance of diplomatic negotiations. Zephyr found herself at the center of it all, a bridge between two worlds that had been at the brink of war. But even as the talks progressed, shadows gathered. Zaxxon, a battle-hardened Talarian warlord, seethed at the thought of peace with the humans. He saw it as a betrayal of Talarian strength, a kowtowing to a lesser species. The fragile peace was put to the test when Earth and Talaria organized a ceremony to celebrate their newfound alliance. Brown, still recovering but determined to stand tall, attended with his son at his side. Zephyr, resplendent in traditional Talarian ceremonial garb, stood at the podium, her voice ringing with hope. That hope shattered as Zaxxon's loyalists struck. Plasma fire ripped through the assembly, sending dignitaries and citizens alike diving for cover. Brown shoved his son behind a marble pillar, his soldier's instincts kicking into overdrive. He caught Zephyr's eye across the chaos, a silent communication passing between them. A scream tore through the din of battle. Brown's heart stopped. He knew that voice. Whirling, he saw his son crumpled on the ground, a scorched hole in his chest. The world went red. Brown carved a path of destruction through the attackers, Zephyr at his side, her own plasma pistol spitting blue fire. But there were too many, a tide of hatred threatening to engulf them. A brown blur shot past them, a snarl of pure fury. Maverick had entered the fray, his teeth bared in a rictus of primal rage. The loyal German shepherd tore into Zaxxon's soldiers, his powerful jaws and claws more than a match for their armor. The dog fought his way to Zaxxon himself, the warlord's plasma blades sizzling to life. They clashed in a whirlwind of fur and steel, Maverick's speed and ferocity against Zaxxon's brutal strength. Zaxxon's blade slashed, drawing a yelp of pain from Maverick. But the dog refused to back down, launching himself at the warlord in a final, desperate lunge. Zaxxon staggered, his balance shattered. Brown saw his chance. His rifle barked, the plasma bolt catching Zaxxon square in the chest. The warlord fell, his eyes wide with disbelief. In the sudden silence that followed, Brown scrambled to his son's side, cradling the boy's limp form. Zephyr knelt beside Maverick, the dog's breathing shallow and labored, his fur matted with blood. Despite Zephyr's desperate ministrations, Maverick slipped away, his eyes never leaving Brown's face. A final, faithful breath, and he was gone. But then a desperate hope. He turned to Zephyr, his eyes pleading. The Talarian technology, the consciousness transfer, could it save my son? Zephyr, her own heart breaking, met his gaze. She understood the unspoken request, the terrible choice he was asking her to make. Slowly she nodded. In a sterile Talarian lab, as machines hummed and lights flickered, Maverick's consciousness was drawn from his cooling body, a web of electrical impulses and glowing synapses. With infinite care, it was woven into the mind of Brown's son, the boy's injuries vanishing as the dog's essence suffused his being. When the boy's eyes opened, there was a new depth to them, a glimmer of Maverick's unwavering loyalty and courage. Brown wept, his tears a mix of sorrow and gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Earth and Talaria moved forward with their alliance, the attack serving as a harsh reminder of the price of peace. Zephyr took up the mantle of leadership, guiding her people into a new era. And Brown, though he mourned the loss of his faithful companion, found solace in his son's smile, in the knowledge that Maverick lived on, a part of their family forever. The scars ran deep, for both worlds and both hearts, but as Brown watched his son race through the fields, a laugh on his lips and a familiar spring in his step, he knew that healing was possible. That hope, like a loyal dog, had a way of enduring. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.